The challenge here for the modern half of the course, 1500 on, is that you have this great big target, or maybe it's two targets, the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. So much of modern history is tied ideologically to the consequences and implications and manifestations, imitations of the French Revolution, or the consequences and imitations and extensions to the Industrial Revolution, that there's no avoiding these big topics in any course. So the problem that you have for a textbook writer is that you start in 1500, you get the New World discovered. Columbus has done his thing. Vasco da Gama has done his thing. Now you have to fill that space between, say, 1500 and 1798, or for the French Revolution, wherever you want to start, the Industrial Revolution. You have to fill that space in a way that covers the whole world. You can divide it up in different ways, but you're going to have to group things. So that, since most people will not take away much in the way of detail, you sort of want them to take away some impressions. So, New World. I've talked quite a bit about issues relating to the New World last week. My general impressions are not the standard ones, but the standard ones are pretty clear. You had indigenous empires that were overthrown by bold conquistadores who reaped huge advantages in terms of gold and silver, and the gold and silver transformed world economies, and the foodstuffs brought back from the New World transformed world diet. That's the Columbian Exchange that Alfred Crosby and others have written about. So the New World has this, an exaggeration of the political side, and a very strong statements relating to the slavery and material culture, and comparatively little about the indigenous populations, which conveniently die anyway, so they don't have to be talked about so much. Then we have Africa. What do we have in Africa? Africa has slaves, which are sent hither and yon, and Africa acquires new products. So that's your take on Africa. Then we have the question of Europe. Europe, fortunately, has some landmarks in here: the Protestant Reformation, the rise of humanism, scientific discoveries of Newton and Galileo and so forth. And so it seems like Europe has a kind of picture, as long as you stick to the western part of Europe. Then we had this chapter, awkward chapter, on India, Persia, and the Ottoman Empire. They're all Muslim, but they don't fit very well together. If I were reconceiving the book, I would probably say what we should do is have India, the Ottoman Empire, and Russia together, and not reify the notion that the Christian-Muslim boundary is one that cannot be crossed in the narrative. But the problem, if you do that, is then you're leaving Persia out. Well, what do you do with it? You can't throw it into the New World or Africa. You can't add it to Europe. So you have to cover these Iranians some way. They're always so inconvenient. So maybe I would have to stick with what we have. Then we get to the chapter that you have assigned for this week. Northern Eurasia. A really, in my view, bizarre label that I don't know of anyone else who uses it. And it's clearly a label of convenience so that you can cover Russia, China, and Japan together, because you didn't cover Russia in your Europe chapter and you didn't cover Russia in your South Asia, Middle East chapter. Russia has to get some coverage. So let's say that Russia belongs with Japan. Well, why in the world would you say that? Ideally, you would say, well, let's talk about East Asia. But then you're leaving out, how do you deal with Eastern Europe and Russia? Or you would say, well, let's have a chapter that deals with the disaggregation of the Mongol continental empire of the 13th century. And that sounds good, except then you don't have no place to put the Japanese. Because they weren't part of that empire. The Mongols tried to conquer the Japanese, did not succeed. And you have to have Japan there someplace. So my co-author came up with the idea of Northern Eurasia. And in the give and take of authors' meetings, we all signed off on it. And we end up with a chapter that has a lot of really interesting and good stuff in it. There's a question of why in the world have we thrown it all into the same basket? Were there other ways to do it? Can we tally up gains and losses? Now, another topic that's been feeding into my thinking about this arises from a class I taught probably 15 years ago. It was a colloquium on transcultural historiography, where graduate students in the PhD program who were interested in non-Western subjects were all thrown into the same class, except those interested in Latin America, because the Latin Americanists would not play ball with this scheme. The idea was, well, these students of East Asia and South Asia and Africa and Middle East have something in common in that they're dealing with non-Western history. So let's call that transcultural, on the grounds that historiography is fundamentally Western in its in the way we do it in what we call history professor history, as opposed to real history. So we would read a book each week and learn how to identify the biases and the preferences, sometimes hidden even to the authors themselves, of the books that we were reading. And the students would read into the biography of so-and-so and say, well, he wrote this history, but, when we look into his personal biography, we find that he was a serial killer, and so he liked serial killers, something like that. Well, we learned to identify all these biases until at the end of the course I said, well, so now, do you believe that every historian is a product of his or her life and times, education, background, social formation, and that they all have some kind of bias, some kind of slant that they are putting on things? And everyone agreed, yes, that surely is true. Oh, professor, you are wise as always. And I said, okay, now you are going to all get PhDs in history, so I'd like to go around the room and have you identify for me what your bias is. And then they all said, well, I don't have a bias. I just recognize that historians, So I said, well, okay, that's fine. You're a graduate student. you don't have your PhD yet. So when you get your degree, we will hand out your bias along with it, so that so you will know what your slant is, what your bias is, and so on. And maybe I provoked some thought in it, but the interesting thing was, when I did it for a second year and went around asking what the bias was, one student said exactly what his bias was. He was a Korean student, and he said, I am going to be a nationalist historian. I'm going to write histories that will glorify my country, because all the countries of Europe went through a stage of nationalist historiography, where people wrote about how wonderful England was, or how wonderful France or Germany or Italy, how great these countries were, how great Islam was, how great China was. Who in the world has ever written a history about how great Korea was? He says, that will be a bias, because I know that another 20 years later, someone will come along and be a revisionist and read my books and say, well, this is just ridiculous exaggeration of the national identity of Korea. I believe he actually did then become a Korean historian. And I really appreciated his comments, because he was right. Countries do often go through a stage of nationalist history. Look at the American myth of the founding fathers and so forth, and how we are savagely taking it apart now. Does every country deserve a moment of nationalist vainglory, celebration? Well, hopefully that would not be a necessity. But on the other hand, how do you get a topic implanted in the historical imagination at the level of world history? Do you have to have some period of rhetorical overkill in order to get there? Henry the Navigator, King of Portugal. What a great figure he is. We have to celebrate him. Well, is he that important? Maybe not. But we went through the period of celebrating him. We've celebrated all sorts of people. We have never celebrated Admiral Yi Sun-shil, the greatest military hero in Korean history, whom I was checking the other textbooks in the field a day or so ago. Not a single one mentions him, except ours, and we don't really say much about him. An admiral who fought 23 battles at sea and won them all, including one in which he had 13 ships as opposed to his opponent's 333 ships, of which 140 were battleships and were combating ships, and the others were mostly logistics. The Japanese, when they defeated Russia in a crucial battle in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, the Japanese admiral declared that his Korean precursor was the greatest naval mind in history, and certainly comparable to Horatio Nelson, for example. And yet, no one has ever heard of him. Admiral Yi, he has a nice statue in Korea, but Admiral Yi is nobody in world history, because there has never been a nationalist Korean history to tell the Korean story with the hyperbole and the emphasis upon glory and achievement that so many other countries benefit from. And they benefit from it because they make events or personalities into household terms. You know, like everybody knows who Robespierre is, or Henry VIII, or Martin Luther, or something. I mean, household terms, part of basic cultural literacy. That does not come about because there is an intrinsic and clear or even unspoken ranking of the importance of events, but rather because there has been a bias on the part of some historians to say certain events and certain individuals are vastly more important than others, and they usually do this in the context of a nationalist history. So what we have in the start of this chapter has to do with a war, or with, not even called a war, it's called Hideyoshi's overseas expeditions. So you have a Japanese warlord named Hideyoshi. Japanese history spends a lot of time talking about Hideyoshi, and even more about his successor, Ieyasu Nobunaga, who founds the Tokugawa shogunate. You know, this really shapes Japanese history, and we talk about the shaping of Japanese history. But Hideyoshi is just mentioned as having made these overseas expeditions to Korea between 1587 and 1592. The word war doesn't get used. If you're a Korean historian, a nationalist Korean historian, you talk about the Imjin War. Imjin is actually in the Korean calendar, it refers to a year period. It's not a place. But the Imjin War, from a Korean standpoint, is as big a deal as the 7 Years' War, the War of Spanish Succession, or First Crusade, any war you want. They can say, and they can say honestly, this is a war on a world scale. 1 million people apparently died. Korea was devastated at a level that historians consider to be beyond the devastation that occurred during the Korean War of the early 1950s. 1 million people are killed at a time when the whole world population is only about 350 million. It's a lot of people. And it was part of an effort by Japan under the command of Hideyoshi to conquer China. You just can't get to China without going through Korea. So he sent over fleets full of soldiers, and all of Korea was conquered, and the Ming rulers of China rather belatedly sent Chinese troops in to bolster the Korean defenses. The parallels with the Japanese strategic thinking in the 20th century are absolutely extraordinary. As if the efforts by the Japanese in the 20th century to conquer Korea, which they ruled as a conquered land for 70 years, and beyond that to then go and conquer mainland China. It's as if that whole script had been written in the 16th century. But we don't talk about that war as a war. In our chapter, though in none of the other world history textbooks, we mention that Hideyoshi would have liked to have conquered China. Well, you know, this isn't, I would like to have conquered China. Oh, I really regret I didn't conquer China. I should have thought to conquer China. Was that it is so understated that the fact that it was the primary intent to conquer Korea, subjugate it, and go on and conquer China, this was the great Japanese event, great Japanese thinking of the 16th century, rather comparable in some respects to the idea of the Crusades. The idea that you are going to take off by sea, go to a nearby land and carry out this conquest. The reason it didn't succeed was because of Admiral Yi. Admiral Yi became a commander of the Korean fleet, one of the commanders of the Korean fleet, and he destroyed every Japanese fleet he came across. The most phenomenal series of victories. And he made it impossible for Japan to conquer China because they could not resupply by sea. They could not carry their troops into China by sea. And he basically saved Korea because Korea was utterly defeated on land. Every part of Korea was occupied by the Japanese. Brutally, murderously, it was one of these horrible occupations. Seoul, Pyongyang, Busan, all these cities came under Japanese occupation. The Korean military forces on land were totally incapable of fighting the Japanese. And the Korean military forces at sea won every engagement, but only if Admiral Yi was in command. There was another admiral whose name was also, unfortunately, Yi. This is Admiral Yi Il, who lost major engagements. This was just Yi Sun-shil, who was the successful admiral. So now this is a rather interesting thing. Not only is the war itself interesting, not only does it deserve to be looked at in world history as a kind of template that Japan will turn to again in modern times, but it also produces a very interesting military history because the notion of a country that is omnipotent at sea and terrible on land, or vice versa, provides a kind of a paradox. Now, of course, this in later times becomes how Britain defines itself. That Britain protects itself behind a fortress made up of the ships of its navy. And it has virtually no land army for a long time. And the land army only becomes used effectively when it gets into colonial engagements in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly the 19th century. And when you get up to World War II, you have this country, World War, that is not very well prepared on land because they are sheltered behind their navy. So here you have, at the other end of the sweep of Eurasia, a country that is saved by its navy and completely undermined by its land forces to the enormous cost. Wasn't just people killed, but most of the cultural monuments of Korea were destroyed. It was a devastating period. Why did you have this inequality? Well, it comes down to the great issue that I've touched on before, the question of gunpowder. The theory of gunpowder empire is applied to Muslim states, as I've said, is neither peculiarly descriptive, nor is it very useful, because it sort of singles out some Muslim states as being arenas where gunpowder has peculiar effect, whereas in fact gunpowder is a huge transformation everywhere, and gunpowder has it has both drawbacks and advantages. And gunpowder is used primarily in two ways, either in cannon or in hand-held, hand-transported weapons. Hand weapons could not shoot very far and could not shoot very accurately. They were not nearly as accurate as good. On the other hand, you required very little training to use them. You just had to trigger the on switch and it would blow up, hopefully not blowing up in your phone face. Whereas using a bow effectively was difficult. So what happened is that the Japanese army was armed with hand weapons, that is to say, gunpowder weapons. The Korean army did not have gunpowder weapons, although it had cannon. It did not have the handheld gunpowder weapons. They relied on archery. You had these large Japanese armies. You're talking about an invasion force of land troops that is, say over 150,000 troops. They are carrying these weapons, and the weapons are not very effective. What happened was that they would fire the weapons together, and then, which created huge clouds of smoke and a lot of noise, and somebody might get hurt. And then the Japanese troops would run at the Koreans with samurai swords. And time after time, the Korean soldiers thought, I think I'll run the other direction. It was the superiority of the Japanese at hand-to-hand combat in the melee, rather than the superiority of their gunpowder weapons, that proved to be the undoing of the Korean land forces. So the Koreans they had troops, but they were never able to stand up to the ferocity of the Japanese attacks. And of course, this immediately gets into the question of samurai and the idea of a hereditary caste of warriors. Korea had people who were aristocrats. The word Yangbang refers to Korean aristocrats, but they were not warriors as a primary calling. They were simply the aristocrats in Korean society. Some of them fought effectively, but as armies, they simply failed. The other thing the Koreans had were cannon. The largest Korean cannon, they had about 4 sizes. The largest Korean cannon was listed as 1 meter long. It's this big. You think of cannons you've seen in the courtyards of old buildings in different parts of the world. This is fairly small by European or even Middle Eastern standards. But you had one that was about 1 meter, another one about 6 inches shorter, and so forth. They fired stone projectiles, or in some case metal projectiles. The smaller ones fired rods that were tipped with metal or stone and had fins to stabilize them. They look like rockets, but they don't have a rocket. Actually, they're more like mortars, I guess, which have fins for stabilization, mortar shells. Now, they had these cannons. Their notion of fortification on land never took cannons into account. That is to say, European fortifications and Middle Eastern fortifications coming out of the crusading era had the idea that if you have a wall, you should have some sort of projection on the wall so that somebody who's out here can shoot at anyone in here trying to climb the wall. So you often have star-shaped fortifications developed, and you could mount cannon on the walls. The Korean walls had no bastions, no special provision for locating cannon, and they were rather easily attacked. They had these walls around fortified places, but they could not use them effectively. On the other hand, they did put cannons on ships, and this is how they won the battle at sea. Admiral Yi is credited in some texts with having invented the turtle ship. The term actually appears earlier, but certainly he made use of turtle ships. They were not numerous, but they would be the core of his fleet. They had originated as vessels to fight against piracy, because Japanese pirates, who were known as woku, had been plundering the coast of Korea and the coast of China for 200 years before this Imjin War. And strategies have been devised to fight against the pirates. The Japanese pirates play something of the role that the Vikings play in European history. They could swoop down on a community, come in, burn the buildings, enslave the people, steal the good things, and be off again before anyone could respond. So the woku are a standard theme in the question of military affairs in China and Korea. The turtle ship was rather peculiar. It had it's called a turtle ship because the deck is covered like with the carapace of a turtle. So you never see a picture of a turtle ship with anyone on deck because they're all under the roof. And the roof is made either of very thick, strong wood, or in the, depending on your analysis of certain sources, or of metal. So some people claim that these were the first ironclad ships, but they weren't. but certainly they were not clad on their sides, which is where the ironclads of the Civil War were important because they were getting broadside cannon. With these turtle ships, the enemy was firing fire arrows or lobbing stones, I guess, that would land on the roof and bounce off. And the notion that they're ironclad may refer to the fact that they had blades that were attached, sticking up to the roof of the ship, so that if you were going to close and climb aboard in the way that some people fought sea battles from the Roman era onward, where the object is to get up to your enemy and grapple, throw grappling hooks and climb aboard and kill all of your enemy. If you climb aboard a turtle ship, you find that you're now on a surface that is studded with upward facing sharp blades. They seem to be more blades than spikes. So it was very hard for the Japanese to board, because once you got on, how did you get in? So these ships look ungainly. They had a flat bottom, or very much like a flat bottom, so that they could turn 360 or 180 degrees within the width of the ship. There was no keel to keep them from turning. So they were extremely maneuverable, but not terribly stable. But if they were wide enough, then their stability was sufficient. They had in the front a dragon's head, not up on a prow like a Viking vessel, but rather more at the waterline. And in the mouth of the dragon, they would place a cannon so that the dragon would spit fire. And they would use other things in the mouth of the dragon, for example, to emit smoke, so the ship would create its own smoke screen, or to send out flames, jets of sulfurous fire, or to have cannonballs coming out. And then once you got close, you'd find that the head of the dragon was also a ram, so that in Admiral Yi's strategy, in a number of his battles, he would simply identify the main ship of the Japanese fleet, where the commander was, and he would proceed to chase it down and ram it and sink it, which he could do more or less with impunity because nobody could attack his turtle ship. They couldn't board it very easily, and the Japanese did not have significant cannon on board their ships. Their idea of a ship was essentially a transport for samurai. And they felt, we are so ferocious that all we have to do is close with the enemy and get on board and we will kill all the enemy. But if you can't get close to the enemy because it is firing at you with cannon, what are you going to do? So that you had a situation where the Japanese were not at all lacking in their warrior zeal, but you simply had a superior technology on the other side, because you had 11 cannon on each side of the turtle ship, pointing out from the sides. You had the cannon coming out of the dragon's mouth at the front. You had 2 cannon facing toward the back, and then you also had a set of oars along with sails, so you could go from sailing to rowing depending on the situation. Admiral Yi turned out to be a genius in strategizing how to use these vessels and his other ships to defeat the Japanese Navy. So you have a war that has first phase around 1587, 1580 to 89 or so, Korea is conquered. Then you have a pause in the war. Then the war is resumed in 1592. And it comes to an end when Hideyoshi dies and the Japanese withdraw their forces. Korea is devastated, but it has regained its sovereignty. Japanese culture has benefited from the carrying of Korean artisans and Korean artists, scientists, to Japan, so that after this war is over, you rather suddenly find that Japan is now producing pottery that is true porcelain that they never produced before, because they have porcelain, they have Korean potters who come in, identify kale and rich deposits that will produce porcelain. So is one of the ways in which Japanese culture benefits from this, even though their plan to conquer China and Korea failed. So it's an interesting episode in the whole saga of the introduction of gunpowder. Why were the Koreans so weak? Well, partly that they actually knew about handheld weapons. They had been presented, oddly enough, by the Japanese ambassador before the war began. He gave a gift to the Korean ruler of several matchlocks. You know, here are modern guns. One Korean advisor said, you know, we should actually make these and distribute them to our army. And then the other advisor said, no, I don't think we need these. So the Koreans had their chance, and they missed it. But of course, one of the issues is, to what degree does gunpowder totally change your economic situation, your training situation, your recruitment situation? There are many areas of technology that are transformative, but military technology tends to weigh more heavily than most other kinds because the consequences are so extraordinary. And yet, they run into problems when they come into conflict with the ideology of warriors. Warriors, I don't know, I was teaching a class once and a student said, you know, Professor Bulliet, what was it like to be in battle against the Mongols? I said, I haven't a clue. The idea of carrying an axe and going up to another man and smashing him in the face, I find that sickening. I couldn't conceivably do that, no matter how many episodes of Dexter I watched. You know, it's just unthinkable that you would go up and kill somebody hand to hand, not a standoff weapon like a bow and arrow or a gun or a bomb from an airplane or something, but just go right up and kill them. Of course, you can win the Congressional Medal of Honor if you do that, but I couldn't even imagine that. But if you are a warrior, if this is what you are trained to or what you feel you are bred to, what is natural to you, this is one of the things that men do. Not me. Other men do this. And I don't understand it. Nevertheless, it is very clear that the aptitude of a warrior, the culture of a warrior, operates according to certain rules. And these rules are culturally inflected. Whom can you kill? Whom can you not kill? Is it possible during a war to commit a murder as opposed to simply killing the enemy? Are there differences between crime and war? And we went through this after 9/11. Terrorist criminals, or are they warriors, or are they in between, enemy combatants, which, they're not wearing uniforms, they're not warriors, not part of an army. On the other hand, if we just say that they're criminals, then it becomes a police matter instead of a war matter. Enemy combatants was somebody's ingenious phrase for that. But there's always this question of rules of war, what you can do, what you can't do. Many of these rules of war hinge on this question of killing from afar. Is it right to kill from a distance? Or should war be conducted hand to hand? There is a interesting new book fairly new, on what happened with the fall of Troy, and what happened, how was war conducted in the Trojan War. And his conclusion, this is a Professor Drew's, he concludes that Homer had no idea how war was conducted at the time of the Trojan War, because the Trojan War is around 1200 BC, Homer is writing around 800 BC, and there are many things in Homer that don't make sense in terms of warfare appropriate to the Trojan period. And one of the most important ones is chariots. In the Iliad, chariot appears as a kind of military taxi. You ride to the battle, you get out, you throw your spear, you wield your sword, you chase Hector on foot around Troy instead of chasing him in your chariot. And yet, there are passages in the Iliad, one where Nestor, the sage advisor to says, in the old days, I remember the chariots would all be lined up for the charge. But there's no chariot charge in the Iliad. And so what this professor has argued is that chariot warfare was conducted overwhelmingly by bow and arrow. And that what you did in a chariot was that it was a standoff weapon. You stayed away from the enemy, you shot bows and arrows, you shot arrows, and if somebody chased you, you rode out of harm's way. It says there never was a charge of chariots against chariots. It says that never occurred, because it's very hard to conceive how it would occur. You may remember in Herodotus, there were chariots that had a scythe sticking out from the side, described as these ferocious armaments of the Persian army that the Greeks had to cope with. A chariot, two-wheeled vehicle, two horses, riding at top speed with the door open, with something sticking out at the side. What would happen if that scythe actually hit? You would fall over, unless it was, something you could just cut through easily, like a stick or something. But if you hit anything that was a significant target, it's a little bit like hitting a stone with a power mower. I mean, you really don't want to do that. And conceiving how chariots could have charged one another, it's been studied. Like, the idea was you charge and you're carrying a lance. Where are you carrying the lance? If it's straight ahead, it's over your own horses. You can't do that. If it is facing backwards, you're running away and you can't use your lance. If it's sticking out to the side, how do you keep from being knocked off the chariot if you hit something? This was finally solved in Europe by the sort of jousting type knight we all know about, where you brace yourself against the stirrups and you absorb the blow in your body. But in a chariot, how would you do that? So anyway, the idea is that chariot warfare dominated the Near East from, say, 1700 to 1200 BC, and then it disappeared and is replaced by hand-to-hand combat, which is what Homer writes about. And this spelled the end of various empires of that era when they shifted from chariot warfare, and the chariot then becomes obsolete. But it remains the ideal that a warrior should have a chariot. And the bow and arrow becomes kind of a coward's weapon. Paris shooting a bow and arrow from a distance. He's not an honorable person. You're supposed to, to be in hand-to-hand combat. All right, that's a digression, obviously. But when you take it up to this question of Imjin War, here you have the Japanese who have thousands of troops armed with hand weapons, with hand guns. And the guns are effective on the battlefield, not particularly because they're so accurate, but because they are an instrument that enables the Japanese to close with the enemy for hand-to-hand, samurai-style combat. And you go just, a couple of decades into the future, into the early 17th century, and Japan quits using guns. There's a book called Giving Up the Gun by a historian named Noel Perrin. People have argued that Perrin has exaggerated and overread his sources and so forth, and yet I think that the essence of it is really correct, that Japan in the 1500s, in the time of Hideyoshi and Oda Nobunaga, they had big armies of people carrying guns, and then they stopped using the hand weapons. They continued to use cannon. They stopped using the hand weapons because they are immoral. Hand weapons enable a commoner who simply knows how to set off the charge and the weapon to kill a samurai. That's not right. A samurai should always win versus an untrained or minimally trained person. There were gun barrels that were put into storage in the early 17th century that were then brought out again in the 19th century and used with new locks and breeches and stocks because they were still there. They were good steel barrels, but they had been locked away. And you had a disarmament. The gun hunt in Japan, as it's called, was an effort by Hideyoshi and then continued to disarm everyone who was not a samurai and who had a gun. Particularly this applied to the monks in the Buddhist monasteries. And it brought, if not a termination, but at least a great diminution of the internal warfare in Japan, because you were taking away the new weaponry and you were reducing the exercise of force to the power of the samurai, each of whom was loyal to a lord, a daimyo, and the code of loyalty, which they had, the bushido, the loyalty of the samurai. This code of fighting was reinforced by various cultural elements, so that you have Zen Buddhism and certain art forms that get to be associated with the culture of the samurai. And the whole notion of the samurai life develops into part of the sort of myth of Japan, and is mentioned in every world history textbook. But the guns are outlawed. Was this effective? At a practical level, I really don't know. So I say there have been questions about the evidence that Perrin uses. On the other hand, it enters into the Japanese culture. So think of the movie The Seven Samurai. You have 7 samurai who are brought to save the villagers somewhere in Japan from the bandits who are causing them a hard time. They're not going to be paid. They're just going to get rice and lodgings. And most of them die. But look at the movie and see what kills them. Every single one of those 7 samurai who dies is shot. Not a single one dies in combat with a bandit. The bandits are simply evil, and they use guns. A proper warrior does not use a gun. I can't remember which movie it is where at the very end the effete, terrible, evil young man who has a gun holds it up and is going to shoot the hero, but he dies before he can pull the trigger. And the hero just looks at him disdainfully. A gun? Really? You're going to shoot me with a gun? All right, that's who you are. Right? You're the sort of person who would shoot me, a samurai, with a gun. Go ahead and do it. What?
Indiana Jones.
Indiana Jones was not a samurai. Indiana Jones was a American lowlife. I mean, a professor of all things. But this was really was really something, and it's very hard for me to believe that you do not have elements of this in the passion people have for martial arts, in which guns aren't used, or in which Bruce Lee or whoever it is easily disarms his opponent with a apt kick or something, because hand-to-hand combat is what men do. In American movies, it's done by the fist. You can't find a classic American movie where the hero kicks somebody. Kick? You're going to kick me? That's what you're going to do? Come on. This is what we do. We're Americans. We use our fists. And what's this kick stuff? This is sissy stuff. That's what girls do. But the thing is, these martial ethoi, become terribly important in shaping the way militaries act. And they inflect the history of technology in ways that are sort of unexpected. So there's a very good book, I can't remember the author now, it's called The Social History of the Machine Gun, in which it's a history of the Gatling gun from the Civil War and the efforts made by the manufacturers, Hiram Maxim, and I can't remember Mr. Gatling's first name, to sell the gun after the war. They couldn't find any army that wanted to buy machine guns because they seemed so unfair. If you had a machine gun, you could kill a lot of people all at once, including officers. And that wasn't right. So you had people trying to sell machine guns to cattle ranchers to chase off the rustlers or to chase off the Indians, because the armies initially would not buy machine guns. they seem to be contrary to the ethos that they had as warriors. Now, this question of a warrior ethos gets into the sort of transcultural role of what is the position of the military as a social force in different countries at different times. Obviously, in Korea, the military did not command much respect. They didn't keep up what was going on. They didn't care very much. The Navy was creditable because they had pirates to deal with, not invasions or big wars of that sort. In the Islamic world that we talked about last week, you had slave soldiers, people who were brought in as slaves and taught to be soldiers, very highly trained. And this was most of your military force in the Ottoman Empire and to a lesser degree in the Iranian Safavid state and in the Mughal state. So there you had a military ethos that was not rooted in the notion of a hereditary aristocracy, but rather in slavery. Europe had a warrior aristocracy. People who disdained business, disdained pretty much anything other than living on their estates, and when called upon, bashing the enemy on the head with an axe. This is what the European upper class did. If you go to the New World, you had a military ethos that we know about, particularly in North America, where the idea of essentially closing with the enemy and slapping him, just counting coup, where you strike the enemy. You don't want to kill him from a distance. You have to strike him personally and carry away a token, a scalp, for example, to show how many people you struck. When you get into economic history and history of trade, history of business, you get very different, in most cases, very different social formations for the people who are engaged in these things. Sometimes not, but your classic entrepreneur is not a warrior. When you look at China, you have a comparatively low status for the military in this period of time, in the Ming period, although that changes after 1600 when the Qing come into China, because they're Manchus and they come from a warrior background. There is a book by a Chinese historian named Ray Huang. The title of the book is a year. I think it's 1587. I can't remember for sure. 1586. 1587. It's called 1587, A Year of No Importance. And what he does is he takes profiles of leading figures in Ming China, not leading at the level of the emperor, but here's like a provincial governor, a Mandarin advisor to the court, this, that, and the other thing. And he says, what was their life like in a year of no particular importance? And one of the people he picks on is a general. It's very clear that generals just didn't have a lot of importance. In Korea, when a general was assigned to a place, he was assigned with a civil official who would go and monitor his performance. This is parallel to what happens in the Soviet Union when you have a commissar who goes to monitor the performance of commanders in the Red Army. But it's also parallel to what you had in the early Islamic period, where you would have a governor of the caliphate who was a general, a military leader, and he would have a civilian accountant, basically, who would be there to monitor him. Governments do not trust the military, and justifiably so when you look historically. Militaries are continually unreliable in overthrowing governments. But the question of how you manage a military when you need it on the one hand, don't trust it on the other hand, and you have the military made up of social elements that may have very different views of the world and very different codes of behavior than other people in the government have. This is a continuing problem. So I focused today on this issue of Japan and Korea, and I want to get into China and Russia on Thursday. This morning I got up at 5 a.m. and flew to Washington, D.C. and lectured for 3 hours to the Foreign Service Institute, got on a plane and flew back to New York, and I'm exhausted. And so even though we are 5 minutes before the end of the period, I'm all done.